Well, perhaps you read the story this last week about a branch manager who was keeping two sets of books. One that he showed to the owner of the company and the IRS, and the other that he kept to himself. He was skimming some money off the top every now and then. It wasn't a lot, at least at first. But then, according to the story, he got greedy and started taking more and more, and he got caught. The branch manager was called in to meet with the owner of the company, who told him that he had a week to get his affairs into order. In other words, he was fired. And that part of the story kind of caught my eye, because in our day, in corporate America, if you're caught embezzling, you're given maybe 5 or 10 minutes to clean out your desk and you're escorted to the door. But he was given a week. According to the story, the firing hit him like a bolt of lightning. He was scared out of his mind. And that night, at home, in bed, he tossed and turned. He was worried about his future, wouldn't you? He knew that his future in working with other people's money was over. How could anyone ever trust him again? And he was too old and out of shape to do manual labor. He thought perhaps he could go down to the club where he belonged and ask around if anybody needed help, but the thought of just doing that was more embarrassing than he could handle. But in the middle of the night, a plan came to him. The plan seemed so good that he decided the next day to put it into operation. When he arrived at the office the next morning, he looked up the names and contact information of all the men who had taken out loans and owed the company money. He invited each of them to drop by that week for a little chat. The first man in was an oil speculator. Given the times, the branch manager knew that he'd had a couple of really hard years. And so when the man entered into his office, the branch manager cut right to the plan. He said, "Looking at your loan, I see here that you owe our company a little over $1 million. I'll tell you what, I'm gonna change that. Let's just say starting today that the new amount is $500,000. How's that sound to you?" Of course, the dealer in oil was elated. And as he left that branch manager's office that day, he said, "You have done me a great service. I hope one day to be able to pay you back." The second man to meet with the branch manager that week was a farmer who'd lost half of his crop due to heavy spring rains. Most of it had been left out in the field to rot. He had no idea how he was going to repay the bank this year for the advance that they had given him for equipment and seed. The branch manager looked at him, looked at the banknote, what he owed, looked back at him and said, "I'll tell you what. You've been a good customer of ours for years, really, and I know that you've had a bad year. So I'm going to change the note. How about this year, instead of paying us back $200,000, let's just make it $160,000. Sound good to you?" The farmer stood up and said, "You've really helped me. I will never forget the kindness you have shown. I hope one day to be able to pay you back." Later that day, as the branch manager was starting to pack all of his stuff in a box, he knew that there were at least 2 people in town who owed him a favor. They had seen the way that he had worked things out for their benefit, and perhaps, who knew, maybe they might even hire him for a job sometime. The bank owner, however, was understandably upset when he found out. But there was nothing that he could do, not really. I mean, if the branch manager had stolen the money, he could have him arrested. But all he had done was to simply make two good friends. People who might take him in when he was out on the streets. The owner, in fact, took it all very philosophically. He reasoned this way to himself, you know, you got to hand it to that guy. The scoundrel was shrewd. When he was backed into the corner, he knew what really mattered. He knew what was most important, and he acted on it. You got to hand it to a guy like that. Now, it's my understanding that there was someone else of that same opinion as the owner of the company. And his name is Jesus Christ. Perhaps you've already realized that the story I just shared with you was not from a page of the Chicago Tribune. Rather, it was from a page in the Bible labeled Luke 16. It's one of the parables that Jesus told, one of the stories that Jesus told. And Jesus was quite a storyteller. Most of his stories, if you read them in the Bible, again, we call them parables, most of his parables had surprise endings. For example, the story of the prodigal son. Remember that story? The youngest brother takes inheritance that was coming his way, and he leaves home, goes out to a far country, squanders it all, and then comes home. And the surprise in that story is the love and the patience of the father when the prodigal returned. No one would have expected that, not even the older brother. Or there's another story in the Bible. It's the story about a despised Samaritan. We call him the Good Samaritan, but he surprised everybody by showing love to his neighbor. Most of the Lord's stories have surprise endings, and this one here today is no exception. The surprise is the unexpected conclusion of the person who's telling the story. And that was Jesus. What Jesus said about that branch manager catches us totally off guard. And now let me read the story for you from Luke 16, beginning with verse 1. Jesus told his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer. The manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master's taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called in each of his master's debtors. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. And then he asked the second, and how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, take your bill, make it 800. And the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than the people of the light. And I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Kind of an odd parable, wouldn't you say? I suggest that the problem with the story and the point of the story come at the exact same place. Let me read this from another translation, the New Living Translation. Brings it out even a little more clear. Chapter 16, verses 8 and 9. The rich man had to admire the dishonest scoundrel for being so shrewd. And then here are Jesus' words. And it is true that the citizens of this world are more shrewd than the godly are. I tell you, use your worldly resources to benefit others and make friends. In this way, your generosity stores up a reward for you in heaven. I think our confusion with this story is that Jesus commended the one that we would condemn. He congratulates the very person that we would criticize. It just doesn't sound like Jesus. It's not what we would expect him to say. And if that's you, I would encourage you to read the story a second time, only a little more carefully. When you do, you will see that Jesus does not applaud this man's morality, but he does applaud his shrewdness. It's almost like Jesus is putting a want ad in the newspaper that reads something like this: wanted, godly men with this man's business sense. Now, some of you, here's my guess on your phone, you're looking up the definition of shrewd, aren't you, some of you? Because you're just kind of sure that it's not a good word. We usually use it in a very negative word. The word can mean canny, clever, conniving. The word makes me think of a poker player who's so good at the game, there's almost no element of gambling involved. He knows all the statistical angles. He's able to read other players, maybe even count cards. He doesn't have to cheat to win. In fact, even when other people cheat, he's still able to win. We tend to think of that word very negatively. However, it can also mean sharp-witted, sensible, and smart. Jesus says, if you want to see shrewd, you're going to probably have to look outside of the community of God's people. Whoa. Here's one place we could land the story today. The truth is that most of us do not put the same level of ingenuity and care into sharing Jesus with others that we put into selling a product to make money. Did you know this? The vast majority of churches in North America are not working. Did you know that? 80% of America's local churches are not growing. They're either plateaued or in decline. That's 80%. 10% of the churches that are growing because of winning the game of musical chairs with other churches. Only 5% of churches in America are growing in a way that works for kingdom benefit. By that I mean, to put it simply, these churches are being used by God to attract people into God's family. Now, there are many churches that have funds in the bank and fabulous buildings on the campus. It's just that they don't have any fish in the boat, so to speak. The mission of Emmanuel Church is this: helping people know Jesus and grow to be like him. Don't miss the first part of that, because you really can't grow to be like Jesus till you come to know him first in a personal way. Our mission here is not to raise money or to put up buildings. Now, that will come in time of necessity. And hopefully it comes fast because there are more and more people coming to Jesus, and that creates a need for more room. But our mission is to win friends for eternity. It's our mission as a church. It's your mission as a Christ follower. And Jesus expects us to use what we have shrewdly to accomplish that mission. You say, where'd you get that from the story? I don't like that word, shrewd. What's that even look like? And first of all, I'll just say to you, it's not my word, it's Jesus' word. Talk to him about it. He uses it 4 times in the story that he told. And then in verse 9 again, Jesus says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. That's a part of the story that might have us scratching our head a little bit. When the great preacher evangelist John Wesley first entered ministry, he observed that many of the traditional things that mattered to people in the Church of England didn't work out in society with real people. Churches were dying. He noticed that the church, as it was done in his day, was not bringing about results. And so Wesley panicked. And he began to make some tactical changes, radical changes in the ways that he brought Jesus to people. If something didn't work, he abandoned it. If something did work and get results, he applied it. So he abandoned churchy language. He abandoned music that didn't seem to fit the times. He quit trying to convince upper-class people that God was worth just a couple minutes of their time per week, and he went on a mission for men and women. In his lifetime, he led over 100,000 people to Jesus. John Wesley, I would say, was shrewd. Ticked off a whole lot of people in England, but God used him. I believe that the point God would have us take home this morning is this. As Christ followers, we should use the same ingenuity, the same creative energy, the same shrewdness in helping people come to know Jesus as the branch manager used to pad his future. This morning as I was driving here, I thought of a story from my own family's life. I was in first grade growing up in Mount Prospect, just south of here. None of our family knew Jesus yet. And there was a new church in town. It had just started. It met in the gymnasium of the grade school that I attended, Bussey School. Our neighborhood was a brand new neighborhood. All the people who lived there, they were first owners of the house. And the man who started the church, his name was Chuck Svoboda, he went about in the neighborhood to invite people to Jesus and to the church that he had started. And here's what he did. He knew that the word would get out that he was on the street and that people just wouldn't answer the door. So he went to every door and he just left a little piece of paper, an invitation to the church. He left that at every home. And then he came back 30 minutes later, and he knew that all of those doors where the paper was gone, they were home. Shrewd, I would say. So he knocked on the door. Our family was one of the doors on which he knocked. And after a while, my mom answered the door. My dad told my mom to say to the preacher man that he wasn't home. But here's what the preacher man figured out. As she was talking at the door, he saw cigarette smoke coming out of the door of the closet right there at the front. Yes, my dad was smoking inside the coat closet. So he knew. So here's what Chuck Svoboda did. He circled their block again and again until one day he caught my dad outside cutting the grass. And he went to him And he talked to him. And in time, my mom and dad, our family, reluctantly went to the gymnasium where that church was meeting. And they came to know Jesus as their Savior in a short time. And each of their kids, there are 3 of us, came to know Jesus personally. And today, each of our kids, some in North Carolina, others here in Illinois, have come to know Jesus. And our grandkids have come to know Jesus. And who knows where it goes from there. But it all boils down to one man named Chuck, who acted shrewdly. And for our family, it's made all the difference in the world. I'm glad he was so shrewd. The point that God would have us take home this morning is to use what we've got, our resources, our influence, our personality, our position, to win friends and influence people toward a relationship with Jesus Christ. Because Jesus is saying here, it's not enough to be good. It's not enough to be dedicated. If you want to be a disciple of mine, you must also be shrewd. Use your resources to gain friends for eternity. The old King James Version reads like this: make friends for yourselves with unrighteous mammon. I think preachers of old liked the King James Version because it took up half the space of sermons just trying to explain what the words meant. But in practical terms, how do we do this? How do we make friends for eternity? One way is by investing in the ministry of other people. A man named Paul was in prison for talking to people about Jesus when he wrote the book of Philippians that's in our Bible. He had just received a love gift from the church at Philippi, so he sends them this note, this letter, this thank you note, if you will, called Philippians. In it, he says this in Philippians 4:17, not that I'm looking for a gift or another gift, but I'm looking for what may be credited, look at the last 3 words there, to your account. Was he just trying to get another gift out of them? No. I don't think there was any business reply envelope inside the letter that Paul sent to the Philippians. He was just saying, you've invested in my ministry, and part of what happens as a result of my ministry will be credited to your account. It's called investing in the ministry of others. You see, giving is not God's way of gaining funds. It's God's way of helping us gain friends for eternity. Think of it that way. Every time you send money to an orphan in India or Bangladesh or Guatemala, think of it every time you support a missionary who's reaching out to lost people in a place where you will never go. Think of it that way every time someone stands on this stage here at Emmanuel and talks about finding Jesus here, knowing that your dollar given to this church resulted in this person's life being changed. It's called investing in the ministry of others. And that's one way that you can make friends for eternity. Here's my guess. Some of you who've been around for a while have far more banked in heaven than you do on earth. I like that. But here's another way. By investing in making friends directly yourself. Let me give you a couple examples. You invite some people in your neighborhood over for a cookout. And when they ask, what can I bring? You say, nothing. We just want to spend some time getting to know the people that live around here. And so you buy the best food that you can afford with no strings attached. Or you're a regular customer at a restaurant of your choice, and often you get the same wait staff When it comes to laying a tip on the table for a $20 bill, you lay down $5. It's more than the norm. Why? It just might lead later to a conversation someday or a relationship that leads to a friendship in heaven. Or it's wintertime, and your neighbor was in Florida when the big snow hit your block, and they're coming home today, and you have a choice. You can either sit in your living room watching your now returned neighbors with their suntanned bodies out shoveling the snow, or you could snow blow their driveway as a welcome home gift. Use your ingenuity. Use your creativity. Use what you've got. Put the same level of shrewdness into gaining friends that will welcome you in eternity that you would use in playing a game of Monopoly on a Saturday night in your home. Put the same level of planning into gaining an eternal friend that you would put into planning next year's vacation. What do you do in planning that? Invest time planning. Think of how to best use your dollar for maximum benefit. Because friends, here's the deal. You really can't take it with you. We can't keep it, but we can give it away. Jack Benny. Waukegan, remember him? Jack Benny used to say, if I can't take it with me, then I'm not going. Well, Jack Benny went, and he didn't take it with him. That's a fact. We can't keep what we've got. So here's what it boils down to. Either you will serve money and use God, or you will serve God and use money. And Jesus says, better to serve God and use money to gain friends who will one day welcome you into everlasting places. At another place in the New Testament, same man Paul was writing to an area, people that on one of his missionary journeys, he led people to Jesus. And now he's writing a letter to them. It's recorded in the Bible in 1 Thessalonians 2:19, where Paul says this, for what is our hope or joy, our crown of rejoicing? He's talking about himself and his band of fellow missionaries. What's our hope? What's our joy? What's our crown of rejoicing? Are not you in the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ at his coming? These are people with whom Paul had shared Jesus. People who would be in heaven because he had shown them the way. And in essence, when you think about what Paul is saying, he's saying that it's like a savings bond. It's like a certificate of deposit, invested now, but at a later time, the value, the increased value, becomes a reality. Not enough, but sometimes I try to practice shrewdness with people that don't know Jesus yet. And a couple of years ago, this time of year, we did an 11-week alpha course in our home with our neighbors. That means that for, I think it was Wednesday nights, for 11 straight weeks, we invited our neighbors in for dinner, really good dinner. And we watched an alpha video, and we had spiritual discussion. And they came every week. I was so discouraged at the end of those 11 weeks, none of my neighbors trusted in Jesus. They've never been in this church. They probably will never be in this church. They don't go to church anywhere. But they came, and they listened. 2 Sundays ago, Judy, who lives 3 doors down, her daughter called me up and said, Judy would like to talk to you. Would you be willing to come down and talk to her? Judy's in her mid-70s and is not doing well physically. So I went there. And that day, I said to Judy, you remember what we talked about back in Alpha a couple years ago? I just wonder, what would be keeping you back from putting your trust in Jesus Christ, even right now, today? And Judy said, I'd like that. 2 weeks ago today, I had the privilege of leading my neighbor to Jesus Christ. Was it Alpha? Was it the good food? Yeah. I tell you, sometimes it's a real delayed action. Don't think just because a friend or a neighbor or a colleague doesn't immediately trust Christ that you've blown it, you've done something wrong. Sometimes there is a delayed reaction. It was a 2-year delayed reaction for my neighbor Judy. I don't know how long it'll be for some of my other neighbors. I'm going to end with this story. It's a story of Sigmund Freud's, which might seem like a weird way to end a sermon, but he tells the story of a sailor who was washed ashore in an island out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and he was soon captured by the natives. Much to that sailor's surprise, he was made a king, given a throne, served the best food, he lived in the best house on the island. But as he learned later, in that native culture, after a man was made king for a year, he was taken to a deserted island and left there to die. Once he learned that, the whole proposition was not nearly so bright being a king, but he hatched this plan. During the year that he was king, he took men over to the island to till the soil and plant crops. He had all of his important possessions moved over. He built a luxurious house, had a luxurious house built for him on that deserted island. Then he sent over all of his closest friends who were told to wait there until he arrived so that he would have someone with whom to socialize. At the end of the year of being king, he was sent to the island, not to starve, but to live out his retirement in luxury. Now, I think Jesus would have chuckled at that story. Realizing he was king only for a year, he made provisions for his future. And I think Jesus is saying the same thing to you and you and you, me today. Not enough to be good. It's not enough to be dedicated. If you want to be a disciple of his, you must also be shrewd, to use your possessions and use your position to make friends for eternity so that when it fails, there will be people in heaven to welcome you home. And it remains true that Jesus tells us today what we already knew coming in, but you can't take it with you. But with shrewd investment in the lives of people, you will make friends who will become the currency of heaven. You think about that. And now I want to pray. God, personally this morning, I thank you for my neighbor Judy, who I think is probably going to get to heaven before me. But for her sake alone, I am so glad that we spent the time and money for 11 weeks of Alpha. And I pray that my other neighbors, I'm thinking of their faces right now and where they live. God, I pray that in your time, they would be born into your family. And now I pray for the people who are sitting here today. My guess is that we've all been thinking of people we work with, people who are family, friends, neighbors, people who don't know you yet. God, may you use the story that your son told a long time ago to deeply engage us in winsome ways of loving on those people enough to share Jesus with them. And help us to do it wisely and smart. In Jesus' name.